Hi again guys, and welcome to another specific car review from, of course, the most recent selection of cars that dropped in the game, and we already discussed one of the new Lexus racing models, the Group 2 Super GT car, of course. We looked at it in a showdown between that, the Nissan, and the Honda, and don't worry, for those who are wanting to get into each car more specifically, we will also be doing that. I'm going to review all three individually, but for now we're going to move on, seeing as we have touched on all three of those at least, to a different one. This one is the other Lexus to drop in that same pack, the RCF. This one's kind of the underdog of the two in many ways. It's Group 3, whereas the other car is the newly debuted Group 2. The pricing on this one though is a lot lower. It's 450 grand. Of course, all of the Group 3 cars are, instead of the 800 grand of the Group 2 cars, or at least all of the Group 2s that we've had so far. Now, the engine on this one is a whole lot bigger. It's a 2 litre on the other Lexus. It's a 5.4 litre on this one, and it's a pretty good sounding engine. Both of them actually sound good in different ways, but the question of course is, what do you actually get? Well, for the difference in category and the pretty huge difference in price as well, it's almost double the price for the Group 2 car. You don't get anywhere near the kind of power or torque increase in that one compared to this one. Now, it does have more. Of course, the Super GT car has over 600 horsepower. This one, though, still has 524. So the difference doesn't necessarily reflect the price, at least on paper. And that's a good way to look at it if you want to. You still get a whole lot of spec for the money on this car. But the question, of course, goes way beyond that, because being entirely different racing disciplines and classes, can it actually translate that to paper? Because I don't think anyone would expect this to be as quick as the Group 2 car, but how good is it in comparison to its direct rivals, the actual GT3 cars, but also some of the fictional Group 3 cars in general as well. Now, as far as torque, this was actually very impressive. It's got 448 pound-feet, which is partially thanks to the much larger capacity engine, which typically do give you quite easy, lazy torque straight off the bat, and the torque on this car is up around the level of the Super GT machines, which is pretty good. Now, the weight, of course, is a lot higher. They weigh barely over a tonne. This one weighs 1,300 kilos, which again is not surprising at all for a Group 3 car, a GT3 car specifically, and the horsepower per tonne is just over 400, 403 to be precise. So, on paper at least, that doesn't sound too bad. It actually sounds pretty good. The engine is pretty large, the power and torque are effortlessly good, the weight is standard pretty much, and even the horsepower per tonne is decent to be working with. So, what's it actually like? Well, it's not bad, that's for sure, but I will say pretty much straight off the bat as far as handling goes, it's no way near the car that its Group 2 sibling is. It's not even close. Now, of course, you wouldn't realistically expect it to be, given that the Group 2 cars from Honda, Nissan or Lexus are all almost as quick as some of the prototypes, and with the right driver they can beat some of the Group 1 cars, especially the Vision GTs. But this one, well, of course not. Of course it's not going to be as quick as those cars, but it's a lot slower. And in fact, I personally found it to be a little bit more sluggish even than some of the other Group 3 cars. Now, I would say that this vehicle feels, maybe in a good way, maybe in a bad way, depending on how you look at it, more like a touring car than a GT3 car. And that's partially to do with the body style. The aero style is even fairly similar to a DTM car these days. The Super GTs are fairly similar as well. But with this one, I would say it feels more like, for instance, well, not really a BTCC car, it's definitely better than that, but something more like an earlier 2000s touring car, like the Astra, or the Mercedes CLK, or even something like the Calibra, but without the all-wheel drive. Not as quick as those, though. Again, that's the funny thing, it feels more sluggish, even compared to those older DTM cars, whereas the Super GT Lexus, which of course is based on an entirely different model as well, but that one feels much more like a modern, up-to-date DTM car, and a lot of you guys commented about that very fact in that Rivals match. It does legitimately look and feel like one. This feels much more like an early 2000s machine. Now, you could view that as a good thing, as I said earlier, because a lot of those are fan favourites. People love the Astra, they love the CLK, and this would be a great rival to those cars. Some of the specs are even very similar. But that's the downside, because in this category, today, against cars of the same era, maybe it's just me, but I found it to be very sluggish compared to a lot of them. It just doesn't feel fast enough to even come close to many of those cars. Now, I know that that must be wrong. I know that it must just be my driving style. Other people doubtless find this car to be excellent. But for me, it just wasn't there. You compare this to other cars, even in the same category of Group 3, fictional or real, stuff like the Corvette, the Viper, the Huracan even, ones that are slightly more challenging, the Audi R8. They are very strong cars in Group 3, whereas this one, it feels like it should almost fit somewhere between Group 4 and Group 3. Almost like a Group 3B, if that makes sense. It feels in a little bit of a no man's land, even though on paper it is of course eligible. It has to be. But it doesn't feel eligible. That's the unfortunate thing. It feels to me like a car that is simply outdated. And maybe I'm wrong, of course. I don't follow the real racing series in real life. I just consider each car as its own thing. And of course, a lot of people got up in arms about me saying that the Lexus was the unknown quantity, basically, in my rival's match. Whoa, did really well in Super GT, what are you talking about? Yeah, well, some of us don't watch Super GT, and I'm not going to apologise for that. It's like saying that you should read a book to appreciate a movie. No, it's a standalone thing. You should be able to appreciate a car without following its entire series and history. That was the case for me. I do not watch Super GT, and so for me it was an unknown quantity. I know that a GTR is a good race car, because I've driven them before. I know that an NSX has the potential to be fast, because they already have been. And so, I very specifically said that for me, the Lexus was the wild card, because I have not driven a Super GT Lexus in the franchise before, and neither has anyone else, because those were GT300 cars, and the SC430 is an entirely different machine. So, all of these people acting like it was some profoundly obvious thing, get over yourself. This one, though, it just feels like a car that's squandered, almost. It's got the potential, for sure, and I said earlier, I'm sure there are people who love it, but for me, it didn't impress me as much as the Group 2 car did. The Group 2 was the best of the three, spoiler alert, it was a fantastic Super GT car to work with, which fully explains why it did so well in the real world. This one, on the other hand, well, not so much. Not for me, at least. So it's worth checking out if you want to represent Lexus, but as far as I'm concerned, there are definitely better Group 3 options out there. If you want to take on some of the lower level machines, if you want to think of it that way, like the Alpha 4C or the Impreza or the Evo, which I consider to be not quite as sharp, again, it's down to personal driving style, but sure, take on those if you want to, but if you're going up against stuff like GTRs, Vipers, Corvettes, well, maybe rein it in a little bit, because the car, to me, feels a little bit out of its depth. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, stick around on the channel for plenty more reviews and tunes also, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.